Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we are finishing up with the article that we started yesterday, and just to address some comments that I know are probably already on part 1, I'd just like to point out that this video was made as a backup video. I've been sitting on it for months, waiting for when I needed to take a couple days off, so I started it before I was splitting my videos up into two 15-ish minute parts. So, no, I do not have plans to make it a regular thing to make the two halves of my videos just as long as one of my whole videos was before I started splitting them. It just kinda happened this way with this one. Anyway, last time we discussed the difference between cosmology and history as literary genres. The author of the article seems entirely unaware that history, as a genre, is specifically about human history, so at best, Genesis can't be history until day 6. Let's see where we go from here.
Scholarship, conservative versus liberal. I think it is fair to say that the poetic view of the Genesis record is relatively new compared to the overall historical understanding of this biblical text.
Which is relevant how? The age of an idea has no bearing on the accuracy of that idea.
A recent writer dates this poetic interpretation to 1924. For the most part, it seems almost unnecessary to point out that conservative scholarship has long rejected the idea that the first chapters of Genesis are poetry.
Conservative scholarship is also the side that rejects the fact that the Pentateuch had multiple authors. Just read through it sometime and look for things that don't seem to match up. Like, for instance, Genesis 37, verses 12 through 36. That's the part of the Joseph story where Joseph gets sold into slavery. His brothers dump him in a pit and then decide to sell him to some passing Ishmaelites. Then, in the middle of the part where they're selling him to the Ishmaelites, it just mentions out of nowhere that Midianite traders passed by. No mention of the Midianites having anything to do with the story, they just pass by. Then the brothers complete their transaction with the Ishmaelites. Then the whole tear his robe, dip it in blood, and show it to his dad thing happens, and then verse 36 says the Midianites sold him in Egypt. So the brothers agree to sell him to a group of Ishmaelites, then Midianites walk by, then the brothers sell him to Ishmaelites, then Midianites sell him to Potiphar. Now, certainly there are apologetics to try and fix this contradiction, like, clearly the Midianites were right there, maybe the Ishmaelites sold him for a profit to them, and then they were the ones who took him to Egypt. But it actually explicitly states that the Ishmaelites took Joseph to Egypt, in which case, why mention the Midianites at all until the Ishmaelites are already in Egypt? Maybe you can make this make sense, but the point is, this is an obvious plot hole or contradiction. If this were written by one single author, he was not a particularly good author. If, however, it were edited together after they had been written, with theological motivations rather than plot-driven motivations, then it is a much easier mistake to make, and it might not even be a mistake. Maybe there was some significance to having Ishmaelites buy him from the brothers, but Midianites sell him to the Egyptians that we just don't understand in our culture and time. Or maybe it was truly just a mistake. Either way, this is evidence that it was written by more than one person before being compiled into one document, and this view is by far the consensus among scholars, and it has been for a couple hundred years now.
In the Bible commentary edited by F.C. Cook, produced between 1871 and 1881, Harold Brown, Bishop of Ely, wrote regarding the first 3 chapters of Genesis. There can be no reasonable doubt that the writer of Genesis puts forth his history as history.
Okay, that's nice. You're taking the outdated opinion of someone who wrote their commentary with clear motivations, and then you quote that to support your idea that it is an historical document rather than any of the other myriad genres. Here's the thing. Even if the author or editor believed himself to be writing history, the theological narrative was more important to him than the details of the story. Today, we are constantly getting caught up in quibbles over contradictions, when the person or people who compiled Genesis into one account would not have been concerned with some of the minor details. They just wanted to get the theological message across.
Though his material is now somewhat dated due to the growth of material resulting from archaeological discoveries, E.H. Plumtree, 1821 to 1891, a renowned British classical scholar and biblical commentator, has illustrated the high level of historical writing even in the pre-Moses patriarchal period.
So here they are referencing a book called History Begins at Sumer by Samuel Kramer. A search through the text of the book shows that the author never used the word patriarchal, never cited or quoted Plumptree, and when talking about Moses was usually referring to a Sumerian king named Ur-Nammu, who he dubbed the first Moses because of the fact that the oldest law code we have so far discovered was written during his reign, predating the Code of Hammurabi by some 300 years at least. The only time he mentions Moses in his book without reference to Ur-Nammu is when he's hypothesizing about the idea that ancient Sumerian erotic poetry could have been the precursor to the Song of Songs, which ended up in the Bible. The page number they referenced is 13 in Roman numerals, so that's before the book gets properly started. On that page, in the first edition, published in 1956, it is the list of illustrations, none of which have anything to do with a high level of pre-Moses history. In the 1859 edition, which is the edition they actually cited, it's the table of contents. I did read through the introduction, though, and they certainly do talk a lot about the many different styles of writing that can be found in ancient Sumer. In fact, it gives a pretty detailed account of how their writing style was developing from 3000 to 2000 BCE, which means that they were working on improving their writing skills during Noah's flood, according to AIG's numbers. And actually, I'd just like to read one sentence from the introduction that I found amusing. In Sumer, a good millennium before the Hebrews wrote down their Bible and the Greeks their Iliad and Odyssey, we find a rich and mature literature consisting of myths and epic tales, hymns and lamentations, and numerous collections of proverbs, fables, and essays. Now, I know the reason this is being brought up is because the author of this article is claiming that we would argue that the genre of history was not invented until Herodotus, and so Genesis could not be history, except that this is something that is completely irrelevant. Even if the author of Genesis was fully convinced that he was writing down actual history, that doesn't matter, as we know that Genesis cannot be actual literal history. One reason for this being that we have evidence of cultures like the Sumerians surviving right through Noah's flood without seeming to notice. You mentioning that the Sumerians were recording their history right through the time of the flood may demonstrate that cultures were interested in recording history well before Herodotus came along and systematized it, but by doing so, it also demonstrates why Genesis, even if intended as history, cannot be literal history.
H.C. Leopold, longtime professor of Old Testament theology at the Evangelical Lutheran Theological Seminary in Columbus, Ohio, in his scholarly 2-volume set of commentaries on Genesis wrote, "We may at this point take issue with the claim commonly raised in our day that Genesis, as to its contents, as well as other older biblical books, falls into the category of poetry rather than history. We are utterly out of sympathy with such an attitude, for it does not conform to the facts of the case. Nothing in the book warrants such an approach. It is rather a straightforward, strictly historical account, rising, indeed, to heights of poetic beauty of expression in the creation account, in the flood story, in the record of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, in Judah's plea before Joseph, and the like. But the writer uses no more of figurative language than any gifted historian might, who merely adorns a strictly literal account with the ordinary run of current figures of speech, grammatical and rhetorical."
Yes, but please notice that while he is pointing out that the authors of Genesis may have been writing what they considered to be a literal history, he is also speaking of Genesis as a whole rather than just the creation account. I would agree that even if you do consider Genesis 1 to be poetry, the majority of the book is written as a story. Whether fiction or nonfiction doesn't matter for my purposes. But he is also commenting on the poetic beauty of expression that the authors used. In other words, even if the authors were convinced that they were writing literal history, they are still using rhetorical devices and figures of speech, meaning that how we might read it and interpret it literally does not necessarily mean that our interpretation is what the authors themselves would have considered to be the literal account. Also worth mentioning is that I looked into the Evangelical Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is now the Trinity Lutheran Seminary and is part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is an LGBTQ-friendly denomination. In my experience, the denominations that tend to be LGBTQ-friendly also tend to take a more liberal approach to scriptural interpretation. They probably don't interpret the male and female he created them, or the for that reason man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, in quite the same way as you do, judging by your collection of anti-LGBTQ articles hosted on your website. All that aside, though, did you know that even if you consider Genesis to be a literal history, there are different degrees of literalness with which you could interpret it? You must know this because nobody, not even the most ardent young Earth creationist, takes the whole thing completely literally. After all, it literally says that God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden not for disobedience or sin, but because they knew good and evil and so were as gods, and God couldn't have beings that know good and evil living forever, so he revoked their access to the tree of life. The story of the fall also has God being unable to find Adam and Eve when they were hiding in the garden. If we were taking it literally, this means that he literally could not find them. But creationists also want God to have all the omnis, omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. He is everywhere, all-powerful, and knows everything. How is it possible to find a hiding place from a God who is literally in every place? This is usually explained away with the idea that God was giving them the chance to do the right thing and turn themselves in, but that is not stated anywhere in the story. That is something that is imposed on the text that isn't really there. What is literally stated is that they hid from God, and God had to ask them where they were. So if I agree that everything in the first 3 chapters is supposed to be completely literal, then I can very easily make the story look completely ridiculous, because taken literally, it is completely ridiculous. And even if you won't agree with that statement, the fact that you don't take these certain verses literally demonstrates the fact that you are at least indirectly aware of this fact.
The professor also points out that classifying the text as poetry allows for a greater variety of interpretation than a recognition of prose would permit.
Did you know that non-poetic language can be used to write things that are not meant to be interpreted as literally true? Sure, it's easier to say that it wasn't meant to be literal if it is poetry, but ultimately the distinction between poetry and prose doesn't really matter for this debate.
In other words, this scholar is suggesting that motive has a lot to do with the poetry interpretation. One of the leading proponents of the poetic interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 openly confesses that the value of this view is to rebut the literalist interpretation of the Genesis creation week propounded by the young Earth theorists.
Yeah, I read through the article that statement came from. Nowhere does he advocate for Genesis 1 or 2 to be viewed as poems. It's mostly just pointing out the various theological motifs found in the creation account and explaining his interpretation of the various aspects of the creation account. To quote from just after the sentence in the article that you quoted, the conclusion is that as far as the time frame is concerned, with respect to both the duration and sequence of events, the scientist is left free of biblical constraints in hypothesizing about cosmic origins. So it appears that, in Klein's view, the Genesis account of creation is scientifically unimportant, but theologically very important. So the scientists are free to draw whatever conclusions are warranted by their studies without worrying about any theological implications of such conclusions.
Consider the testimony of the celebrated Edward J. Young. This learned scholar wrote, "Genesis 1 is not poetry or saga or myth, but straightforward, trustworthy history, and inasmuch as it is a divine revelation, accurately records those matters of which it speaks. That Genesis 1 is historical may be seen from these considerations. 1. It sustains an intimate relationship with the remainder of the book. The remainder of the book, i.e. the generations, presupposes the creation account, and the creation account prepares what follows. The 2 portions of Genesis are integral of the book and complement one another. 2. The characteristics of Hebrew poetry are lacking. There are poetic accounts of the creation, and these form a striking contrast to Genesis 1. 3. The New Testament regards certain events mentioned in Genesis 1 as actually having taken place. We may safely allow the New Testament to be our interpreter of this mighty first chapter of the Bible."
Professor Young held to many non-consensus views, including the view that the Book of Isaiah had a single author, which it almost certainly did not. And while I can grant that Genesis 1 may very well not be poetry, that says nothing to how it should be interpreted. And as for the appeal to the New Testament does mention the creation myth of Genesis, certainly. Specifically, Jesus, the man who is known for speaking in parables that are rife with metaphor and alternate interpretations, referenced various aspects of creation several times. And because this guy who is famous for his non-literal statements and stories mentioned it, that means we must take it literally, of course.
Professor Davis again. Genesis is an example of classical Hebrew prose and generally reads with considerable consistency and smoothness.
Notice the word generally in that statement. If something is generally consistent and smooth, then that means it is not always consistent and smooth. The break between Genesis 2:3 and 2:4 is one example of such an inconsistency. There are several others, places where it is obvious that two separate stories have been combined to form one story, like the aforementioned portion of the Joseph story where the Midianites and Ishmaelites got mixed up, or the two flood accounts that are intermixed, sometimes with conflicting details. Let me just ask you a hypothetical question. If I were to tell Mrs. Rhino that I am generally considerably faithful to her, do you think she would be happy with that statement?
In the last 3 decades, the pressure of scientific opinion has increased to the point that some biblical scholars have made sweeping concessions, abandoning a literal interpretation of the text in favor of a mythical or poetic interpretation.
Which is the smart thing to do. When science shows that a literal interpretation of Genesis is conclusively impossible, if you want Genesis to continue being an important part of your religion, then the intelligent thing to do is to find a way to interpret it with theological significance that doesn't directly contradict a huge chunk of modern science.
Secular cosmology versus history. Let me comment on a statement cited earlier, namely that the first 2 chapters in Genesis are cosmology, not history. Secular cosmology, a scientific study of the possible origin and structure of the universe, and history are separate fields of discussion. Moses was not a scientist commenting on some alleged natural, mechanical process for the origin of the universe. He was writing under the guiding force of the Spirit of God. And speaking of divine fiat action, this is history. Sacred history.
So Moses was not writing about the origin of the universe? That seems to be what you are saying here. The statement that it is history, sacred history, implies that the religious aspects are more important than the scientific aspects, which is a good reason to not interpret it literally. And Genesis 1 is another spot where creationists don't really interpret it literally. It literally states that God made a firmament, a solid dome over the earth to separate the waters of heaven from the waters of earth. According to the Anchor Bible's 1978 translation by E.A. Spicer, the word that is usually translated as firmament was translated as firmamentum in the Latin Vulgate, which means something made solid. The Hebrew word was raki, which refers to something that is beaten out or stamped, like metal, referring to a thin but solid sheet of material that is stretched out to make the sky and support the waters above the sky. Strong's Concordance and Larry Pierce's Outline of Biblical Usage both support this interpretation. I have never heard a creationist that is not also a flat earther argue for a literal solid dome supporting water above the sun, moon, and stars.
In his commentary on Genesis, Harold Steigers, former professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College, discussed the attempt of modern scholars to identify the Genesis record with ancient cosmogonies. Regarding this matter, he emphatically stated, "The Bible story of creation is not a cosmogony. Conclusions founded on such a characterization cannot stand."
Okay, well, since a cosmogony is literally any model concerning the origin of the universe, can I then take this as your admission that Genesis 1 and 2 are not about how the universe began?
Cosmogony, in this sense, would be an attempt to find a naturalistic explanation for the origin of the universe.
No, a cosmogony is just any model about the origin of the universe. It doesn't have to be naturalistic. Now, sure, in modern times we are more concerned with figuring out how things actually happened than with coming up with stories of what we think might have happened, but that doesn't make Genesis 1 and 2 any less of a cosmogony. But yeah, throughout this whole article you've constantly shown a lack of understanding of the nuances of different genres, so it shouldn't really surprise me that you don't get the basic fact that any attempt at an explanation of the origin of the universe is by definition a cosmogony.
Genesis supplies a supernatural explanation. In the beginning, God. Thus is sacred history, not speculation.
Here's where it can get a little bit interesting. The Anchor Bible translation, that's the one by E.A. Spicer that I referenced earlier, has the first couple of verses as, "When God set about to create heaven and earth, the world being then a formless waste with darkness over the seas and only an awesome wind sweeping over the water." This implies that certain things existed before God did any creating, a formless waste, the seas, a windstorm, the world. Did God create the formless waste, the seas, the windstorm, and the world? It doesn't appear to be so, at least not if we're taking it literally, that is.
Regarding the issue whether the Genesis record is history, Dr. Alan P. Ross, Ph.D., University of Cambridge, was the author of the commentary on Genesis in the Bible Knowledge Commentary. In his introduction, he discusses this question: is Genesis history? Therein he quotes Norman Porteous, distinguished Old Testament scholar in Scotland and very distant relative of Rhino, to the effect that the reason many modern scholars disregard Genesis as history is due to the reality that Israel's religious traditions made frequent reference to supernatural interventions, and that such is enough to make the historian look askance at them and assume that the actual course of events must have been quite different.
Yeah, that's actually part and parcel of figuring out human history. When reading a document regarded as history from any culture, when supernatural events are referenced, the base assumption is that the supernatural aspects of the story are not historically accurate. If we ignore this assumption, then there are lots of stories of history that need to be rewritten. For instance, the Roman emperors were literally gods, sometimes with healing powers and the ability to perform other miracles. Do we add these abilities into our modern accounts of Roman history as if they are factual? If not, why do we then ignore supernatural claims made by non-Christian and non-Jewish cultures, but then have to accept the ones made by the Christians and the Jews? You can't give special treatment to the claims of one culture over another unless you have good reason. Being written in prose rather than poetry is not good reason. Most of George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series are written in prose, and yet I would imagine that there are very few people arguing for us to take it as a literal history of anything.
Conclusion. Frequently, young teachers and writers are influenced by certain sources and adopt positions that have their ultimate roots in infidelity. They themselves would never dream of espousing the aberrant views that lie beneath their scholastic speculations, yet they have brought this theological baggage, unwittingly perhaps, with them from the dark and distant land of a rationalistic influence.
This is absolutely the most ridiculous statement made in your entire article. The way you phrase this exposes you as being more than a bit of a hack. And it is nicely topped with the final sentence referring to a rationalistic influence as being a dark and distant land from which they bring the theological baggage. You know, because being rational is a bad thing. This whole article displays a lack of nuance and understanding. The main thrust of this article seems to be based on a false dichotomy, the idea that something is either literal history or poetry. Though you do seem to be aware that poetry itself can be historical in genre, you seem completely unaware that prose is a style that encompasses literally every other genre, fiction and non-fiction alike. If it is not poetry, it is prose. A receipt from your grocery purchase is written in prose. Your article is written in prose. The book, I Need a New Butt, is written in prose. And most of the Bible is written in prose. Being prose instead of poetry does not say anything about whether or not that prose is meant to be interpreted literally, and all signs point to a non-literal interpretation of Genesis not only being easier to reconcile with science, but also having theological implications and possibly being closer to the original intent of the author. By insisting on a literal, simplistic interpretation of Genesis, you are stripping the book of its cultural significance, its literary beauty, its historical value, its nuance, and its potential deeper theological meaning. When you hear people refer to the creation myth found in Genesis as being the scribblings of ignorant goat herders, that opinion is based on the overly simplistic interpretation that people like you are forcing on the book. If you were to allow it to be looked at with a less superficial lens, nobody would be able to complain about the ignorant goat herders, because then you wouldn't have people running around and making obviously unscientific claims like a 6,000-year-old universe, a 6-day creation, people who live to be 900 years old, talking snakes, a 600-year-old man building a giant boat to save animals from every continent from a worldwide flood, Abraham being afraid that his fairly close relatives in Egypt, which they would have had to have been given how soon the story happened after the flood, he was afraid that they would kill him just for finding out that he was married to Sarai. I could go on. You do a disservice to a book that has been as historically and culturally significant as the Bible to insist on your interpretation, and this disservice is a direct result of young Earth creationism. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from David Meyer, who says, "Personally, I happen to believe that the moral argument for God is completely meaningless because it's fundamentally flawed. Why do I say this? It's because God doesn't need to be good to exist. God could be real and evil. There is no reason for God to actually be good. It can be evil and still exist. Now, personally, I don't think there is a God, but there you go." Yeah, that's another problem with it. It presupposes that we know enough about God to say that God is good, and good comes from God. But it relies entirely on the idea of might makes right. Objective morality is objective because God is the objective measuring stick. Why does God get to be the measuring stick? Because he's God. Okay, but when he straight up kills a dude for trying to protect the Ark of the Covenant, I would call that bad. Well, it can't be bad because God did it. How does that follow? Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, and What Jesus, who are the forbidden fruit that allow you to know the good and evil that is my channel. If you'd like a talking snake to convince people to eat you, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!